Mrs. Jean Patterson woke to a scream at 2:17 in the morning on the 4th of November, 1983. It was a woman's voice, young, piercing through the thin walls of Cromwell Street like a knife. Jean sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening. Her husband Ron snored beside her, oblivious. The scream came again, muffled now, then cut off abruptly, as if someone had clamped a hand over the mouth. She knew where it came from. Number 25, the West's house. Jean got out of bed, walked to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to see. The street was dark, sodium lights casting orange pools on the pavement. Number 25 looked the same as always, shabby net curtains, peeling paint on the door, Fred's van parked out front with F. West Builder painted on the side in crooked letters. Everything was quiet now. Too quiet. She stood there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Just the distant hum of traffic from the main road and the wind rattling the bins. Jean let the curtain drop, climbed back into bed, and reached for the radio on her nightstand. She turned it on, volume up, until the voices of the late-night talk show filled the room and drowned out her thoughts. Ron stirred, mumbled something, rolled over. Jean lay staring at the ceiling until dawn broke, gray and cold, over Gloucester. If this story hits you, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's begin. It all started 12 years earlier, in the spring of 1972, when the Wests moved in to 25 Cromwell Street. Jean remembered it clearly because she'd lived on the street her whole life, 38 years, and she knew everyone. The house had been empty for months, the previous tenants evicted for rent arrears. When Fred and Rose arrived with a lorry full of furniture and 3 small children, the neighbors came out to watch. Fred West was a short, wiry man with a thick Gloucestershire accent and hands like shovels, calloused and stained with grease. He smiled easily, joked with the men helping him unload, called everyone mate like he'd known them for years. Rose was younger, maybe early 20s, plump and quiet with dark hair and a baby on her hip. She didn't say much, just nodded when Jean came over with a pot of tea and some biscuits. "Welcome to the street," Jean said, handing over the plate. "I'm Jean, number 22. If you need anything, just knock." Rose took the biscuits without smiling. "Ta." Fred appeared at her side, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That's very kind of you, love. We're going to like it here, I can tell. Nice and quiet, good for the kids." He gestured to the children running around the front garden, 2 girls and a boy, all under 10. Jean smiled. "It's a good street. Working people. Keep to ourselves mostly." "Perfect," Fred said. His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Just what we need. A fresh start, like." That first year, Fred made himself indispensable. He was a builder by trade, worked all over Gloucester, and he offered his services to the neighbors at cheap rates. He fixed Mr. Davies' leaking roof, repointed Mrs. Ellis's brickwork, installed new gutters for the family at number 18. He was chatty, friendly, always had a story about a job gone wrong or a client who tried to stiff him. People liked him. He was one of them, working class, rough around the edges, but reliable. Rose kept to herself more. She'd stand in the doorway smoking, watching the children play, but she rarely joined the other women for tea or gossip. Jean noticed she was pregnant again within months of moving in, then again a year after that. By 1975, there were 6 children at number 25, maybe 7. Jean lost count. The house was always noisy. Kids shouting, music blaring, Fred's power tools whining at odd hours. But that was normal for Cromwell Street. This wasn't a posh neighborhood. These were terraced houses built in the 1920s for factory workers, narrow and damp, with thin walls and shared alleyways. You heard everything: arguments, televisions, babies crying. You learned to tune it out, to mind your own business. Behind closed doors, Jean's mother used to say, that's where people's lives happen, and you don't go poking your nose where it doesn't belong. But there were things you couldn't ignore. By the late 1970s, the noises from number 25 changed. It wasn't just children playing or Fred hammering. There were screams, thuds, the sound of something heavy being dragged. Jean heard it. Mrs. Ellis next door heard it. Mr. Davies across the street heard it. One evening in the summer of 1978, Jean was in her kitchen washing dishes when she heard a crash from next door, followed by a girl's voice shouting, "No, please don't!" Jean froze, hands in the soapy water. She looked at Ron, who was reading the paper at the table. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ron didn't look up. "Hear what?" "That shout from the Wests." Ron turned the page. "Probably one of the kids misbehaving. You know, Fred's strict." Jean dried her hands slowly. Nothing now, just the tick of the kitchen clock and Ron's paper rustling. She went back to the dishes. The morning after the scream at 2:17, Jean stood at her front window with a cup of tea, watching number 25. At 6:30, Fred emerged from the house in his work clothes, cigarette hanging from his lips. He opened the back of his van, looked up and down the street, then disappeared back inside. A minute later, he came out carrying something large, wrapped in an old carpet, rolled tight and bound with rope. He hoisted it into the van with a grunt, slammed the doors, and drove off. The street was still asleep. No one else saw. Jean stood there, tea going cold in her hand, and told herself it was building materials. Fred was always hauling stuff, plasterboard, timber, bags of cement. That's what it was. Had to be. She finished her tea, washed the cup, and got ready for work at the biscuit factory. She didn't tell Ron what she'd seen. She didn't tell anyone. Because what would she say? That she saw Fred West loading something into his van at dawn? So what? He was a builder. That's what builders did. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Jean thought about the scream. The way it had stopped so suddenly. The weight of the thing Fred carried. And she turned the radio up louder until she couldn't think anymore. By the early 1980s, everyone on Cromwell Street knew the Wests took in lodgers. It made sense. They had a big house, lots of kids, always needed money. Young people came and went, mostly girls, usually in their late teens or early 20s. They'd arrive with suitcases and hopeful faces, renting the rooms on the upper floors. And then, a few weeks or months later, they'd be gone. Mr. Alan Davies, who lived at number 19 directly across from the Wests, watched this revolving door. He was retired, spent his days in the front room with the racing pages and a cup of tea, and he noticed things. There was a blonde girl, he told his wife Marjorie one afternoon in April 1981. Young thing, pretty. Saw her move in last month with 2 suitcases and a carrier bag. Haven't seen her since. Marjorie looked up from her knitting. Maybe she moved out. Without her suitcases? Maybe Fred drove her to the station. Alan grunted. Maybe. The thing was, the Wests seemed like decent landlords. The lodgers never complained, not where anyone could hear. Fred would help the girls carry their bags upstairs. Rose would offer them tea, and the children would play in the garden like everything was normal. Some of the girls stayed for months, became familiar faces on the street. Kathleen Richards was one of them. She moved into 25 Cromwell Street in 1973 when she was just 17 years old, escaping an abusive home. She stayed for a year, renting a room on the top floor, and she survived. Years later, when the bodies were found, Kathleen would tell reporters how the Wests treated her. They were friendly, helpful, very pleasant, she said. Rose cooked meals. Fred fixed things around the house. I never suspected anything. They seemed like a normal family. But even Kathleen noticed strange things. Fred would insist on showing visitors the cellar, taking them down the narrow stairs into the damp, dark basement where he kept his tools. "Come on, I'll show you where I work," he'd say, grinning. Some people went down out of politeness. Some made excuses and stayed upstairs. And Rose had rules. The children weren't allowed to bring friends into the house without permission. The lodgers were told not to enter certain rooms. There were locks on doors that shouldn't have locks, bolts on the inside of the cellar door. Kathleen left in 1974, found a flat with her boyfriend, and never looked back. She was lucky. Others weren't. Mrs. Ellis, who lived at number 27, right next to the Wests, remembered the girl with the red hair. It was the summer of 1979, hot and sticky, the kind of weather that made everyone irritable. The girl had arrived in June, carrying a battered suitcase and wearing a denim jacket despite the heat. She looked lost, Mrs. Ellis said to her daughter Linda over tea. Poor thing, couldn't have been more than 19. I saw her on the doorstep with Rose, and Rose was smiling, saying something about a nice room with a view. Linda stirred her tea. "Mum, why do you care about the West's lodgers?" Mrs. Ellis frowned. "I don't know. There's something about that house, something not right." "You've been saying that for years." "And I'll keep saying it." The girl with the red hair stayed for 3 weeks. Mrs. Ellis saw her coming and going, always nervous, always glancing over her shoulder. Then one morning in July, she was gone. Mrs. Ellis noticed because she'd gotten used to seeing the girl sitting on the front step in the evenings, smoking and watching the street. She mentioned it to Fred a few days later when he was out front working on his van. "That young lass who was staying with you," Mrs. Ellis said, casual as she could, "the one with the red hair, she move out?" Fred looked up, wrench in hand, grease smeared on his cheek. "Oh, her? Yeah, did a runner in the night. Owed 2 weeks' rent, the cheeky mare. Rose was furious." He laughed, shook his head, went back to his work. Mrs. Ellis walked back to her house slowly. She told herself it made sense. Young people were flighty, unreliable. They'd skip out on rent, leave without warning. It happened all the time. But that night, she found a shoe in the alley behind the houses. A girl's shoe, red canvas with white laces, small, maybe a size 5. It was tucked behind a bin, dirty and scuffed. Mrs. Ellis picked it up, turned it over in her hands. It looked like the kind of shoe the red-haired girl wore. She stood there for a long moment, holding the shoe, and then she dropped it back behind the bin and walked away. Alan Davies kept a mental list of the girls who went into number 25 and didn't come out. He didn't write it down, didn't tell Marjorie the full extent of what he noticed, but he counted. There was the blonde girl in 81, the redhead in 79, a brunette with a Scottish accent in 83, a girl with a limp in 85, a young woman with a baby in 87, though the baby left and the woman didn't. Alan would sit in his chair, watching the house across the street, and he'd think, where did they go? One afternoon in 1986, he asked Fred directly. They were both outside, Fred trimming the hedge, Alan fetching the milk from his doorstep. "You still taking lodgers, Fred?" Fred straightened up, shears in hand. "Now and then. Why, you know someone looking?" "Just curious. Seems like you get a lot of young girls through. They don't stay long." Fred grinned. "They're all the same, Alan. Come thinking it'll be cheap and easy, then realize it's hard work keeping a place clean, paying rent on time. Most of them bugger off after a few weeks, can't handle responsibility." Alan nodded slowly. "Right, makes sense." Fred went back to his hedge. Alan went inside, closed the door, and said to Marjorie, "That man's a liar." Marjorie looked up from the television. "What?" "Fred West. He's lying. I don't know about what, but he's lying." The neighbors talked among themselves, quietly, over fences and in corner shops. They'd say things like, "That house gives me the creeps," or "I wouldn't let my daughter lodge there," or "Something's not right with the Wests." But no one called the police. Because what would they say? That young women moved in and out of a house? That wasn't a crime. That Fred was friendly but strange? Lots of people were strange. That Rose kept to herself? So did half the street. And besides, Cromwell Street wasn't the kind of place where people called the police. This was a working-class neighborhood, poor, rough around the edges. The police didn't care about streets like this. They didn't care about missing lodgers or girls who might have run away. You handled your own problems. You kept your head down. You survived. Jean Patterson said it best one evening in 1984, standing in her kitchen with Mrs. Ellis, drinking cheap wine and talking in low voices. "We all know something's wrong in that house," Jean said. "We all know it. But what are we supposed to do? We've got no proof. Just feelings. Bad feelings." Mrs. Ellis nodded. "And who listens to feelings? The police would laugh us out of the station." Jean refilled their glasses. "So we do nothing. So we do nothing." Summer 1978 was brutal. The heat settled over Gloucester like a wet blanket, thick and suffocating, and the smell started. In mid-July, it came from the West's back garden, drifting over the fences into the neighboring properties, a sweet, rotten stench that made your stomach turn. Mrs. Ellis complained to her husband first. "It's like something died back there," she said, standing at the kitchen sink with the window open, trying to catch a breeze. "I can't hang the washing out. It gets into the clothes." Her husband Derek sniffed the air. "Probably a dead fox or rats. You know, Fred's always got rubbish piled up. I'll mention it to him." But when Derek spoke to Fred over the fence that evening, Fred just laughed. "Oh, that. Yeah, sorry about that, mate. I'm putting in new drains, digging up the old pipes. Must have hit a sewer line or something. Should clear up in a few days." It didn't clear up. The smell lingered for weeks, getting worse in the heat, and other neighbors started complaining too. Jean Patterson mentioned it to Rose at the corner shop, trying to be polite. "Rose, love, is everything all right with your drains? There's a bit of a smell coming from your garden." Rose was loading bread and milk into a carrier bag. She didn't look up. "Fred's sorting it. He's always digging something up or putting something in. Don't worry about it." Jean paid for her groceries and left. Outside, she met Mr. Davies, who was coming in. "Smells like death, doesn't it?" Alan said, not quite joking. Jean forced a laugh. "Don't be morbid, Alan. It's just drains." But she didn't believe it. Fred West was always digging. That's what everyone remembered later when the police came. He was always out in the garden with a spade or a pickaxe, always excavating, always building something. "I'm putting in an extension," he'd say, or "I'm fixing the foundations," or "I'm laying a new patio." The work never seemed to finish. One month he'd be digging up the back garden, the next he'd be breaking through the cellar floor with a pneumatic drill. The noise was constant, hammering, drilling, cement mixers churning at midnight. Neighbors would lie awake listening to it, wondering what the hell Fred was doing down there. Mrs. Ellis heard it worst because she shared a wall with number 25. At night, when the house was quiet, she'd hear sounds through the brickwork, scraping, thudding, and sometimes, faintly, a low moaning sound that could have been wind in the pipes or could have been something else. She mentioned it to Derek once, lying in bed in the dark. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Derek was half asleep. "Hear what?" "That sound, from next door, like someone's moaning." Derek sighed. "It's the pipes, love. Old houses make all sorts of noises. Go to sleep." Mrs. Ellis lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. She told herself Derek was right. It was the pipes. It had to be. Fred was charming. That was the problem. He could talk his way out of anything, make you laugh, make you feel stupid for worrying. When Mr. Davies complained about the noise in 1980, Fred invited him in for a cup of tea and showed him the cellar. "See, Alan, I'm converting it into a proper workshop. Gotta do it right, you know. Can't cut corners. That's why it's taking so long." The cellar was dark, damp, with bare brick walls and a concrete floor. There were tools everywhere, saws, hammers, bags of cement stacked in the corner. It smelled of mold and something sharper, chemical. Alan looked around, nodded. "Right, well, just try to keep it down after 10, yeah? The wife can't sleep." Fred clapped him on the shoulder. "Course, mate, sorry about that. I get carried away, you know how it is." Alan climbed the narrow stairs back up to the kitchen, where Rose was making tea. She smiled at him, handed him a cup. "Fred's a hard worker," she said. "Always got some project on the go. Drives me mad sometimes." Alan sipped his tea. "Yeah, well, as long as he's keeping the place up." He left feeling reassured. Fred was just a keen DIY enthusiast. Nothing sinister about that. But the digging continued. And the smell came back in the summer of 1983, worse than before. This time, Jean Patterson confronted Fred directly. She marched over to number 25 one afternoon in August, rang the bell, and waited. Fred answered in dirty jeans and a vest, cigarette in his mouth. "Jean, what can I do for you, love?" "Fred, that smell, it's back. My whole house reeks of it. What the hell are you doing in that garden?" Fred took a drag, blew smoke to the side. "Ah, yeah, sorry about that. I'm digging up an old septic tank. Should have been done years ago. It's all rotted through. Absolute nightmare. But I'll have it sorted by the weekend, promise." Jean crossed her arms. "You've been saying that for 5 years, Fred." Fred laughed, not offended. I know. But this time I mean it. Scout's honor." He was so affable, so friendly, that Jean felt her anger deflate. She sighed. "Just please, Fred. It's making people ill." I hear you, love. I'll get it done. Promise." He closed the door. Jean walked back to her house, and Ron asked, "What did he say?" "Same as always. He's fixing it." "And you believe him?" Jean sat down heavily. "I don't know what I believe anymore." In 1985, social services came to number 25. There had been reports about the children, concerns about neglect, maybe abuse. A social worker arrived one morning in a beige car, clipboard in hand, and went inside. The neighbors watched from their windows. Jean stood behind her net curtains, heart pounding, thinking, finally, someone official, someone who'll see what we see. The social worker stayed for 40 minutes. When she came out, her face was pale, her mouth set in a tight line. She got in her car and drove away without looking back. Jean waited for the police to arrive. They didn't. She waited for the children to be taken away. They weren't. Nothing happened. A week later, Jean saw the social worker's supervisor in town, pure coincidence, and she stopped her. "Excuse me, you're from social services, aren't you? You came to 25 Cromwell Street last week." The woman looked uncomfortable. "I can't discuss cases." "I'm not asking you to discuss it. Did you see? Did you see what's happening in that house?" The woman's expression hardened. Sorry, I don't know your name, but I can assure you we take all reports seriously. If there was evidence of harm, we would act. Now, if you'll excuse me." She walked away. Jean stood on the pavement, people flowing past her, and felt a cold certainty settle in her gut. No one was coming to help. No one was going to stop whatever was happening at number 25. Not the police, not social services, not anyone. Because Cromwell Street was just another poor working-class street in Gloucester, and the people who lived there didn't matter. That night, Jean sat in her kitchen with Mrs. Ellis and Mr. Davies, the three of them drinking tea and speaking in hushed tones. "We all know," Jean said, "don't we? We all know something terrible is happening in that house." Mrs. Ellis nodded, hands wrapped around her mug. "I hear things, at night, through the wall. I hear crying. I don't know what I hear." Alan Davies stared at the table. "I've seen girls go in and not come out. I've watched Fred carry things to his van at strange hours. I've smelled that bloody smell for 7 years." Jean looked at them both. So what do we do?" Silence. "We can't call the police," Mrs. Ellis said finally. "We've got no proof, just suspicions. They'll think we're hysterical." "And even if they came," Alan added, "Fred would charm them. He'd show them around, Rose would offer tea, and they'd leave thinking we're mad." Jean felt tears prick her eyes. "So we do nothing? We just let it happen?" Alan met her gaze. "What choice do we have?" None. They had no choice. They finished their tea. They went home and turned their radios up and tried not to listen to the sounds from number 25. And the digging continued. By the mid-1980s, everyone on Cromwell Street knew what Rose West did for money. They didn't talk about it openly, not in daylight, but in whispers over fences and in knowing glances at the corner shop. There was a red light in the upstairs window of number 25. Not subtle, not hidden. It glowed from dusk until late into the night, visible from half the street. Cars would pull up at all hours, after work, late evening, sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning. Men would get out, check the street, knock on the door, and disappear inside for 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Then they'd leave, collars turned up, faces averted, and drive away. Mrs. Ellis stopped being able to sleep properly in 1984. Her bedroom shared a wall with the West's house, and she could hear everything. Footsteps on the stairs, bed springs creaking, muffled voices, sometimes laughter, sometimes sounds that made her pull the pillow over her head. "It's a bloody brothel," she said to Derek one morning, exhausted and furious. "Right next door to us, and no one does anything about it." Derek was shaving at the mirror. "What do you want me to do? Call the police? They won't care. Prostitution's not exactly their top priority." "It's illegal, isn't it?" "Technically, but prove it. And even if you could, what then? Rose gets a fine. Fred gets a warning. They're not going anywhere, love. Just ignore it." But you couldn't ignore it. The street was saturated with it. The cars, the men, the red light burning like a beacon. Children playing outside would see the visitors and ask their parents questions. Teenagers would snicker and point. Everyone knew. Alan Davies kept a log in his head of the vehicles. He couldn't help it. Retired, bored, and deeply curious, he'd sit by his front window with the racing pages and watch. There was a blue Ford Escort that came every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. A gray van with a builder's logo on Fridays. An expensive-looking Jaguar on Sunday afternoons, always the same time, like clockwork. "Regulars," Alan muttered to himself. "She's got bloody regulars." Marjorie came into the room with tea. "Still watching that house, Alan?" "Someone should." "Why? What good does it do?" Alan didn't answer. Because he didn't know. He couldn't stop what was happening, couldn't prove anything illegal beyond the obvious, couldn't make anyone care. But he watched anyway, compiling useless evidence in his mind, like it mattered. The children at number 25 were isolated. That's what struck Jean Patterson most. Other kids on the street played together, ran in and out of each other's houses, formed little gangs. But the West children kept to themselves. They'd play in their own front garden, rarely venturing beyond the gate. If other children approached, they'd look nervously at the house, at the windows, as if checking for permission. Jean asked one of them once, a girl about 10 years old, if she wanted to come round for lemonade. The girl's eyes widened. "I have to ask Mum." "Of course, love. Go on then." 5 minutes later, Rose appeared at the door, arms crossed. "Jean, is it?" "That's right. I just invited your daughter for a drink. Thought the kids could play together." Rose's expression didn't change. "That's kind, but no. We like to know where the children are at all times. Too many strange people about these days." The irony wasn't lost on Jean. She forced a smile. "Of course, another time maybe." Rose closed the door. Jean never asked again. But the worst thing, the thing that haunted the neighbors later, was that they normalized it. They stopped being shocked by the red light, the cars, the strange men. It became part of the fabric of Cromwell Street, like the rubbish collection on Thursdays or the ice cream van on Saturdays. "That's just what Rose does," people would say. Or, "Well, she's got all those kids to feed." Or, "Not my business what goes on behind closed doors." They looked away. They turned up their televisions. They told themselves it wasn't their problem. One evening in August 1986, Jean and Mrs. Ellis stood in Jean's kitchen, curtains open, watching number 25 across the back gardens. A man had just gone inside, middle-aged, wearing a suit. The red light glowed in the upstairs window, like a warning. "Do you think the girls upstairs?" Mrs. Ellis started, then stopped. "The lodgers?" Jean finished. "Do I think Rose makes them work, too?" Mrs. Ellis nodded. Jean watched the house. "I don't know. Maybe. Fred's always got young girls living there. Pretty ones. Vulnerable ones. Would make sense, wouldn't it?" "God, that's horrible." "Yeah." They stood in silence, drinking their tea, watching the house, doing nothing. The man in the suit left after 40 minutes. Then another car pulled up. Then another. It was a busy night at number 25. At 11:30, when most of the street was asleep, Jean heard shouting. She was in bed, Ron snoring beside her, when a woman's voice cut through the night. "Let me out! Please, somebody help me!" Jean sat bolt upright. The voice was coming from number 25, from somewhere upstairs. "Help! Please!" Jean scrambled out of bed, ran to the window, pulled back the curtain. She could see lights on in the West's house, shadows moving behind the curtains. Then the front door flew open, and a young woman burst out. She was naked, stumbling, her hands clutched around herself. She ran down the front path, into the street, barefoot on the cold pavement. "Help me!" she screamed. "Please, someone help me!" Jean's heart hammered. She looked at the houses opposite, at Mr. Davies' place, at Mrs. Ellis next door. Lights were on. People were watching from their windows, but no one opened their door. Fred appeared in the doorway of number 25, fully dressed, calm. He walked down the path slowly, like he was out for a stroll. "Come on now, love," he called to the woman. "You're making a scene. Let's get you back inside, eh?" The woman backed away, shaking her head. "No, no, I'm not going back in there. You're crazy, both of you." Fred kept walking toward her, hands out in a placating gesture. "You're upset, I get it, but it's cold out here and you've got no clothes on. People are watching. You don't want to embarrass yourself." The woman looked around wildly at the houses, at the windows, at the lights behind the curtains. "Please," she shouted, "someone call the police, please." No one moved. Fred reached her, put his arm around her shoulders gently, like a father comforting a daughter. "There we go. Come on back inside. We'll sort this out, yeah? Just a misunderstanding." The woman was crying now, but she stopped resisting. She let Fred lead her back up the path, back through the front door, back into number 25. The door closed. The street was silent. Jean stood at her window, shaking, tears streaming down her face. She looked across the street at Mr. Davies' house. She could see him behind his curtain, watching. Their eyes met for a moment across the darkness. Then he let his curtain fall and turned away. Jean climbed back into bed. Ron was still snoring. He'd slept through the whole thing. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, and whispered into the darkness, "What have we become?" Heather West disappeared on the 19th of June, 1987. She was 16 years old, dark-haired, quiet, the oldest daughter of Fred and Rose. The neighbors noticed she was gone because Heather had been a fixture on the street, always outside with the younger children, helping Rose with shopping, sitting on the front step reading. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Mrs. Ellis asked Rose about it a week later at the corner shop. "Haven't seen Heather around. She all right?" Rose was loading cigarettes into her bag, not making eye contact. "She's run off, hasn't she? Got herself a boyfriend, moved away. Typical teenager. Can't wait to get out." Mrs. Ellis frowned. Really? She didn't seem the type. Rose's expression hardened. "Well, she did. Didn't even say goodbye properly. Ungrateful, after everything we did for her." Mrs. Ellis left the shop feeling uneasy. Heather running away didn't make sense. The girl was responsible, mature beyond her years, and she'd been close to the younger siblings. Would she really just leave without telling anyone? But Fred had a different story. When Mr. Davies asked him about Heather a few days later, Fred said she'd moved up north with a lesbian lover. "Yeah, turns out our Heather's a dyke," Fred said, laughing. "Who knew, eh? She's shacked up with some woman in Birmingham. Good riddance, I say. She was getting mouthy anyway." Alan blinked. "Right. Well, as long as she's safe." Fred winked. "Safe as houses, mate. Don't you worry." The stories kept changing. Rose told one neighbor Heather was working at a holiday camp in Wales. Fred told another she'd joined a traveling fair. Someone else heard she was in Spain. Jean Patterson confronted Fred about the inconsistencies in July. "Fred, where exactly is Heather? Because I've heard 5 different stories now." Fred was in his front garden, trimming the hedge. He didn't stop working. "She's wherever she wants to be, Jean. She's 16, not a kid anymore. She can do what she likes." "But doesn't it worry you, not knowing where your daughter is?" Fred finally looked at her, shears in hand, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heather knows how to look after herself. And between you and me, we're better off without her. She was causing trouble, making accusations, stirring things up. Best for everyone that she's gone." Jean felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of accusations?" Fred's smile widened. "Nothing worth repeating. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." But the worst part, the part that made neighbors physically sick when they remembered it later, was the joke. Fred started making jokes about Heather being under the patio. He'd say it casually, laughing, when people asked about her. "Oh, Heather, she's under the patio, love. Keeps asking me for a cup of tea, but I tell her she should have thought of that before she got cheeky." People would laugh uncomfortably, not knowing how to respond. It was such a dark joke, so specific, so bizarre. But Fred delivered it with such good humor that you couldn't tell if he was serious or just had a sick sense of humor. Mrs. Ellis heard him say it in 1989, 2 years after Heather vanished. "Fred, have you heard from Heather at all?" Fred was loading tools into his van. He grinned. "Nah, she's still under the patio. Keeping quiet. Best place for her, really." Mrs. Ellis forced a laugh. "You're terrible, Fred." "I know," he said, still grinning. Mrs. Ellis walked away and said to her husband that night, "He's joking, isn't he? He has to be joking." Derek was watching television. "Course he is. Fred's always had a dark sense of humor. Don't take it seriously." But Mrs. Ellis couldn't stop thinking about it. The joke was too specific, too repeated. And Heather was still gone. No letters, no phone calls, no contact with her siblings. In 1988, Anne Marie West, Fred's daughter from his first marriage, went to the police. She reported years of sexual abuse by her father and stepmother, abuse that had started when she was a child and continued into her teens. The police interviewed her, took statements, and investigated. Nothing happened. The case was dropped. Insufficient evidence. Anne Marie's word against Fred and Rose's. And Fred was charming, believable, while Anne-Marie was troubled, damaged, the kind of witness juries didn't trust. The neighbors heard whispers about it. They heard that Fred's daughter had made accusations, that social services had been involved, that the police had come round. But Fred was still there, living at number 25, working as a builder, waving at people in the street. So, the accusations must have been false, people reasoned. Must have been a family dispute, a vindictive daughter trying to get back at her parents. They wanted to believe that, because if the accusations were true, it meant they'd been living next to monsters for 20 years. It meant every scream they'd ignored, every girl they'd seen disappear, every time they'd turned away and done nothing, had been a betrayal. So they chose not to believe. Jean Patterson lay awake one night in 1990, thinking about all of it. Heather, Anne-Marie, the lodgers, the screams, the smell, the digging. She turned to Ron, who was reading beside her. "Ron, do you think Heather's really alive?" Ron looked at her over his book. "What kind of question is that? I mean, she's been gone 3 years. No one's heard from her. Fred makes those awful jokes. What if—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ron put his book down. "Jean, love, you're letting your imagination run wild. Heather ran away. Lots of kids do. She's probably fine, living her life somewhere, just doesn't want contact with her parents. It happens." "But what if she's not?" "Then there's nothing we can do about it," Ron said firmly. "We're not detectives. We're not social workers. We're just people trying to live our lives. And I know you care. I know you worry. But you can't save everyone. You can't fix everything that's wrong in the world." Jean felt tears prick her eyes. "So we just ignore it?" Ron took her hand. "We survive, Jean. That's what we do. We survive." On the 24th of February 1994, police cars descended on Cromwell Street. It was early afternoon, cold and gray, when the first vehicles arrived. Marked cars, unmarked cars, vans full of equipment. Officers knocked on the door of number 25. Fred answered, still in his work clothes. "Mr. West, we have a warrant to search the property." Fred's face went pale. The neighbors came out of their houses, stood on their doorsteps, watched. Mrs. Ellis gripped Derek's arm. Jean Patterson felt her legs go weak. Alan Davies stood across the street, perfectly still, watching everything. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Don't know," someone else replied, "but it's big." The police brought in digging equipment, dogs, forensic teams in white suits. They cordoned off the front garden, then the back garden, then extended the cordon to include the entire house. And they started digging. The first body was found on the 25th of February 1994, buried in the back garden of 25 Cromwell Street. It was Heather West. She hadn't run away. She hadn't moved to Birmingham or joined a traveling fair or gone to Spain. She'd been murdered by her parents and buried under the patio where Fred had joked about her for 7 years. When the news spread through the street, Mrs. Ellis vomited in her kitchen sink. Jean Patterson sat on her sofa and couldn't stop shaking. Alan Davies stood at his window, staring at number 25, and said quietly to Marjorie, "We knew. God help us, we knew." The digging continued for weeks. The police excavated the garden, then the cellar, then tore up floorboards in the house. They found bodies under the bathroom floor, under the cellar floor, buried in the garden. 12 bodies in total. 12 young women and girls, some as young as 15, all murdered between 1973 and 1987. They'd been tortured, dismembered, buried in shallow graves beneath the house where Fred and Rose raised their children. The media descended on Cromwell Street like locusts. Television crews, reporters, photographers, all crowding the narrow street, filming the house, interviewing neighbors. "Did you suspect anything?" they asked. "Did you hear anything unusual? Why didn't you call the police?" The neighbors stammered, fumbled for answers. How could they explain 20 years of willful blindness? How could they admit they'd heard screams and turned up the radio, seen girls disappear and convinced themselves it was nothing, smelled death and told themselves it was drains? "We didn't know," they said. "We had no idea." But they had known, hadn't they? Not the specifics, not the bodies, but they'd known something was deeply, horrifically wrong at number 25. And they'd done nothing. Fred West was arrested on the 25th of February. He confessed almost immediately, gave detailed descriptions of the murders, led police to the burial sites. He seemed almost proud. Rose was arrested days later. She denied everything, claimed she knew nothing, said Fred had acted alone. No one believed her. On New Year's Day, 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell at Winson Green Prison. He used strips of bedsheet, did it in the early morning hours when the guards weren't watching. He left no suicide note, no explanation, no apology. When Mrs. Ellis heard the news, she said to Derek, "He took the easy way out, left Rose to face it alone, coward to the end." Rose West's trial began in October 1995. The courtroom was packed, media, victim families, curious onlookers. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the bodies, the torture implements found in the cellar, the testimony of survivors like Anne-Marie and Kathleen Richards. Rose sat in the dock, expressionless, occasionally shaking her head. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. On the 22nd of November 1995, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 10 counts of murder. Rose West was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. She would die in prison. The victims' families wept. The neighbors, watching on television, felt no relief. Justice had been done, but it was too late. 20 years too late. On the 8th of October 1996, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. The council made the decision. The house was too notorious, too toxic to remain standing. Demolition crews tore it down brick by brick, loaded the rubble into skips, hauled it away to an undisclosed landfill site. They didn't want anyone keeping souvenirs, building shrines, turning the place into some macabre tourist attraction. Where the house had stood, they created a pathway, a simple walkway, connecting the two halves of the street. Number 25 ceased to exist. But the neighbors remained. 30 years later, in 2024, some of them are still there. Mrs. Ellis, now in her 80s, still lives at number 27. Jean Patterson moved away in 97, couldn't bear to stay. But she still dreams about the screams. Mr. Davies died in 2009, took his guilt to the grave. The ones who remain don't talk about it much, not to each other, not to outsiders. What is there to say? A documentary crew visited Cromwell Street in 2023. They interviewed the residents, asked them about the Wests, about living with the stigma for 3 decades. Mrs. Ellis agreed to speak. She sat in her front room, the same room where she'd heard sounds through the walls for years, and told them, the authorities should have done more. Social services, the police, they all failed those girls. But, she paused, looked down at her hands. We failed them too, didn't we? All of us on this street. We heard things, saw things, and we told ourselves it wasn't our business. We were wrong. The interviewer asked, "Do you think you could have stopped it?" Mrs. Ellis was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe Fred and Rose would have killed those girls no matter what we did. But I'll never know, will I? Because we never tried. We never even tried." The pathway where 25 Cromwell Street once stood is clean now, just gray concrete and a small plaque that says nothing about what happened there. The council didn't want to memorialize the horror, but the neighbors remember. Every time they walk past that empty space, they remember the house that stood there, the people who lived in it, the girls who went inside and never came out. They remember the screams they ignored, the smell they explained away, the naked woman running into the street while they watched from behind their curtains. They remember choosing silence over action, comfort over courage, self-preservation over justice. And they live with it. Jean Patterson, now 74 and living in Devon, was asked in an interview last year what she'd say to the families of the victims. She started crying before she could answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We should have known. We did know. We knew something was terribly wrong, and we did nothing. And those girls died because of it. They died because we were cowards. All of us. Every single person on that street. We were cowards, and 12 women paid the price for our cowardice." The psychology of collective silence is well documented. When an entire community witnesses abuse but fails to act, it's not usually because they're evil or heartless. It's because they're human. They're afraid of being wrong, of making trouble, of standing out. They're bound by social norms that say you don't interfere in other people's business, especially in working-class communities where distrust of authority runs deep. They rationalize what they see, find innocent explanations for sinister evidence, because the alternative, accepting that monsters live among them, is too terrifying. And when everyone around you is also staying silent, it becomes easier to convince yourself that silence is normal, that it's the right choice. But it's not. The silence on Cromwell Street allowed Fred and Rose West to murder 12 women over 14 years. The silence fed the horror, protected the killers, condemned the victims. And the silence still haunts the survivors, the neighbors who chose not to see. You never suspect you're living next to murderers. They don't announce themselves. They blend in, smile at you over the fence, help you fix your roof, borrow sugar, seem normal. But deep down, the neighbors of Cromwell Street knew something was wrong. The screams told them, the smell told them, the girls who vanished told them. They knew, and they did nothing. That's the real horror of 25 Cromwell Street. Not just what Fred and Rose West did behind those doors, but what an entire community allowed them to do by choosing silence over action. The house is gone now. The killers are dead or imprisoned, but the guilt remains, and it always will.